When Colonel Forsyth's body was found in the heart of his lavish library, door locked from the inside, glass as pristine as his reputation, and a stopped clock that betrayed only one fatal mistake, Miss Eleanor Graves set aside her knitting needles. "The killer is here," she murmured with a knowing smile, "and anyone who thinks this is merely a game of possibilities is making a grave mistake." The dawn had barely touched the sleepy rooftops of Blackwood Hollow when Miss Eleanor Hargraves stepped into her garden, the crisp air carrying the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine. A pair of shears in hand, she moved with precision, clipping away wilted roses, her sharp gaze missing nothing. The village was waking. Mr. Pembroke, the baker, wheeled out fresh loaves, their golden crusts steaming in the morning chill. Mrs. Whitmore bustled down the cobbled street, her knitted shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. But Eleanor noted the way her eyes darted, how she clutched a letter in her hands, as if it carried something far heavier than mere words. A distant church bell chimed the hour, and just as Eleanor straightened, the stillness of the morning was fractured, a whisper of hurried footsteps, a shadow slipping between alleyways. The tension coiled in her chest. Blackwood Hollow, despite its charm, had always been a village of secrets, and today the air bristled with something unseen yet undeniable. The post office was abuzz, its cramped space thick with the scent of ink and damp paper. Mr. Thorne, the postmaster, glanced up as Eleanor entered, but before he could greet her, the door banged open. Margaret Finch, breathless, her usually impeccable curls disheveled, clutched the counter with trembling fingers. "Thorne," she gasped, her voice barely above a whisper, "the letter, it's gone." A hush fell. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her basket. The letter, the same one Mrs. Whitmore had held so tightly. Mr. Thorne's expression darkened. "That's impossible. It arrived last night. Special courier, locked in my office until morning." Margaret shook her head, her face drained of color. "Then tell me why the drawer was open, and the letter is missing." Eleanor met Mr. Thorne's gaze, reading the fear behind his carefully guarded expression. A stolen letter, a missing message, words that someone somewhere was willing to risk everything to keep hidden. Outside, the village square buzzed as usual, yet beneath the surface, unease rippled. The hollow was stirring, its secrets shifting in the shadows. Eleanor turned toward the looming silhouette of Ashford Manor, where the reclusive Lord Ashford lived in self-imposed exile. It was said he hadn't stepped beyond its gates in over a decade, but if whispers were to be believed, last night, someone had seen a figure at his window. Ravenswood Manor stood like a silent beast against the backdrop of the darkening sky, its shadow stretching over the village of Blackwood Heath, as if swallowing the last remnants of daylight. Inside, in the heart of the grand estate, Colonel Reginald Ashcroft sat in his study, his fingers tracing the rim of a crystal glass filled with deep amber brandy. The air was thick with the scent of aged tobacco and polished mahogany, but beneath it lingered something more insidious, a tension so sharp it could cut through the silence. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9, its hollow sound echoing through the vast corridors, each note a reminder that time, relentless and unforgiving, was slipping through his grasp. A knock at the door, firm yet deliberate, broke the stillness. Arthur Sinclair stepped inside, his posture impeccable, his expression a practiced mask of concern and calculation. "Colonel, I trust you received my note." His voice was smooth, edged with the kind of confidence that came from knowing secrets others wished to keep buried. Ashcroft studied the man with the precision of a seasoned strategist, his mind dissecting every nuance of his tone, every flicker of movement. "I did," he replied, his voice as steady as the hand that gripped the glass, "and I trust you have answers." Sinclair allowed a measured smile. "I always do." He moved closer, the firelight catching the glint of his cufflinks, the controlled ease of his stride betraying nothing. "The matter of the safe, Colonel," he continued, lowering his voice, "I must insist on its security being re-evaluated. There are concerns." Ashcroft exhaled slowly, his gaze never leaving Sinclair's concerns or suspicions. Sinclair tilted his head slightly, the gesture almost feline in its curiosity. "Does it matter?" For a long moment, the only sound was the soft crackling of the fire, the weight of unspoken words pressing against the heavy oak walls. Then with deliberate ease, Ashcroft rose from his chair and strode to the far side of the room, where an oil painting of his late wife hung, a portrait of beauty frozen in time. With the precision of a man who trusted nothing but his own hands, he reached behind the frame and pressed a concealed latch. The painting swung forward, revealing the steel face of a safe, its surface unmarred, its secrets locked away. Sinclair's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "A fortress within a fortress," he murmured. "Impressive, necessary," Ashcroft corrected, his fingers grazing the combination dial. "The contents of this safe, Sinclair, are more than valuables, they are leverage, they are insurance." He turned back, meeting Sinclair's gaze with a look that held both warning and invitation. "And they are mine." Sinclair's smile did not waver, but the air between them had thickened, charged with a silent understanding, one that neither would voice but both acknowledged. "Of course, Colonel," Sinclair said smoothly, stepping back. "One must always protect one's assets." He reached for his coat, his movements unhurried. "I'll be in touch." As he exited, the door closing softly behind him, Ashcroft turned back to the safe, his expression unreadable. Outside, the night pressed against the manor, like an unseen force, the wind whispering secrets through the ancient trees, and in the study, the clock struck 9:30, its chime cutting through the silence like a blade. The air in Blackthorn Hall was thick, not just with the stale remnants of last night's cigar smoke, but with something darker, something that clung to the walls like an unseen presence. The heavy drapes had been drawn against the morning light, casting long shadows over the grand study, where Colonel Henry Rathbone sat slumped over his desk, a brandy glass still in his hand, his eyes fixed in a final silent stare of disbelief. Edward Linwood, the late Colonel's distant cousin and reluctant heir, stepped back from the doorway, his face draining of color. "Dear God, he's dead," he muttered, though his voice carried an undercurrent. Was it shock or something else? Perhaps, just perhaps, a trace of relief. Mrs. Oliver, the housekeeper, let out a sharp breath, her trembling hands sending the breakfast tray crashing to the floor, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the suffocating stillness. I must fetch the doctor," she stammered, already turning toward the hall, her panic spreading like a fever through the house. Halstead arrived. Blackthorn Hall had become a storm of hushed voices and furtive glances, the whispers of the servants growing louder, speculation curling through the corridors like smoke. "Poison," Halstead announced grimly, after a brief examination, his fingers lifting the Colonel's limp wrist before releasing it back onto the mahogany surface. "And I'd wager death took him sometime around 9 last night." The words sent a ripple through the house, and then beyond, into the village, where the news spread with the inevitable speed of scandal. In the marketplace, where vegetables were haggled over just an hour before, now there were only hurried whispers. In the tailor's shop, where customers had stood for fittings, now they leaned in close, their voices laced with intrigue. And at the ivy-clad Rosewood cottage, where the scent of tea and lavender usually perfumed the air, the news reached Eleanor Harrow, a woman known to some as an aging widow, but to others, to those who truly paid attention, as something far more formidable. "Dead, you say?" Eleanor murmured, stirring her tea with slow measured precision, her mind already fitting the puzzle pieces together. "In his study, and the door locked." Her voice was mild, but her sharp, perceptive eyes held a glint of something deeper, something no one else in Blackthorn Heath had quite yet grasped. Mrs. Fawcett, her neighbor, leaned in with wide eyes, bolted from the inside. She confirmed, her voice quivering with excitement. No signs of a struggle, nothing disturbed, almost as if he simply sat down with his drink and never rose again. Eleanor took a contemplative sip of her tea, the gears of her mind already turning. How very interesting. One locks a door to keep danger out. But what if the danger was already inside? The thought gnawed at her. The colonel had been a meticulous man, precise in his habits, regimented in his routines. He would not have locked the door unless he had reason to, unless he had trusted the one who had handed him his death. Eleanor rose, smoothing out the folds of her dress. I believe I shall pay my respects. But the truth was, respect had very little to do with it. The moment she stepped out onto the cobbled street, she could feel the weight of the village's collective gaze following her, unseen but palpable. Blackthorn Heath was a place where whispers lived longer than people, where secrets did not die but only grew heavier with time. And now, in the wake of the colonel's mysterious demise, the entire village seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable unraveling of the truth. Each step toward Blackthorn Hall was a descent deeper into the heart of a mystery, where the smallest details, a misplaced object, an offhand remark, a single footprint in the wrong place, could mean the difference between justice and deception. The grand iron gates creaked open upon her arrival, and the house itself loomed before her, its Gothic facade stark against the cold morning sky. She was met by Julia Rathbone, the colonel's widow, her mourning attire impeccable, her expression composed, but her hands as they reached to accept the bouquet Eleanor carried, trembled ever so slightly. "You are too kind, Mrs. Harrow," Julia murmured, her voice a careful mixture of grief and control. "These are such difficult times." Eleanor's gaze did not waver. "I imagine they must be," she replied softly, her words gentle yet weighted with something unspoken. Julia hesitated, just for a moment. "I was the last to see him, you know," she added, her fingers tightening around the stems of the flowers. "He was in good spirits, as far as I could tell." Eleanor noted the slight hitch in her breath, the way her gaze flickered away rather than hold steady. "And the door?" she asked, her tone light but deliberate. "You found it locked when you returned?" "Yes," Julia confirmed quickly, too quickly. "No one went in after I left." But something in her posture betrayed her. Was it fear, guilt, or something more elusive, more difficult to name? As Julia excused herself, disappearing down the hallway, Eleanor turned her attention to the study door. She ran a gloved hand lightly over the brass handle, her sharp eyes catching the faintest, almost imperceptible scratch near the keyhole, something that should not have been there, not in a house so meticulously maintained. She stepped to the window, where a single damp leaf lay on the sill, a remnant of the previous night's storm, or perhaps something more. The air inside Blackthorn Hall was heavy, but it was not just with the scent of stale cigars and aged brandy. It was heavy with the weight of unspoken truths, with secrets just waiting to be unearthed. And as Eleanor turned back toward the shadowed hall, she knew one thing for certain: this was not the end of the mystery. This was only the beginning. The air inside Hawthorne Manor was suffocating, thick with the scent of old books, burnt tobacco, and something far more insidious, secrets that had festered too long beneath the surface. Clara Ashford stood rigid in the dimly lit drawing room, her sharp eyes blazing with resentment, her fingers gripping the back of a velvet chair, as though it were the only thing keeping her upright. Probing, questioning, yes, one might call it that, she snapped, her voice laced with years of bitterness, the kind that came from being overlooked, pushed aside, and now being suspected. "But let me make one thing clear, Mrs. Harrow, I had no hand in this sordid affair." Across from her, Eleanor Harrow remained composed, her gaze steady, her hands idly adjusting the lace on her gloves. "Family can be complicated," she mused, her voice as soft as the whisper of wind against glass. "Old grievances have a way of festering. But then sometimes, it's not the obvious enemies we should watch for." Clara stiffened, her mouth pressing into a thin line. "Are you implying something?" "Not at all," Eleanor replied, a small enigmatic smile curling at the edge of her lips. "Only observing. You see, in my experience, The most telling stories are whispered, not shouted. Clara let out a short, breathless laugh, turning away with a muttered excuse about fetching tea. But Eleanor's eyes lingered on the room, the heavy, oppressive decor, the dust undisturbed on the shelves, except where one book had been recently moved, the faint scent of something metallic beneath the layers of lavender and aged wood. Every detail was a thread in a tapestry she had not yet seen in full. Hawthorne Manor, with all its opulence, felt less like a home and more like a gilded cage, a place where greed, jealousy and fear intertwined like ivy on the stone walls. It was not a house of mourning, it was a house holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable unraveling. The tension in the grand hall thickened as the heavy oak doors creaked open, and Edward Rothwell strode in. His steps were quick, his expression taut with irritation, his tailored suit rumpled as though he had not slept. The scent of whiskey and tobacco clung to him like a second skin. "Mrs. Harrow," he said, his voice edged with impatience, "I wasn't expecting visitors." Eleanor tilted her head slightly, her expression one of quiet amusement. "Just offering my condolences," she murmured, her tone gentle, her eyes keenly attuned to every flicker of emotion in his face. "I understand you inherit everything." Edward's jaw tightened. His eyes darted to the fireplace, the curtains, the brandy decanter on the sideboard, anywhere but at her. "That's the law, isn't it?" he muttered. "But don't think I had anything to do with this. I may have debts to settle, but murder," he exhaled sharply. "Not my style." Eleanor merely nodded, her fingers absent-mindedly adjusting the yarn in her knitting bag, though her attention was elsewhere on the sideboard, where one decanter was ever so slightly out of alignment with the others, its cut glass stopper sitting just a fraction too loose. A detail that might mean nothing, or everything. The conversation was interrupted as Beatrice Winslow entered, her face pale, her hands trembling as she clutched a handkerchief. "He was more than just my employer," she said suddenly, breaking the silence like a crack of thunder. He had become paranoid, seeing enemies in every shadow, and then that detective, Mr. Lennox, he arrived weeks ago, saying he was here to protect him. Edward's head snapped up, his gaze sharp with sudden interest, though whether it was alarm or something else, Eleanor could not yet tell. "Lennox?" he repeated, his voice carefully measured. "And what exactly did he have to do with any of this?" Eleanor's hands continued their slow, methodical work, though her ears were tuned to every syllable. "A detective, you say?" she mused, her tone deceptively light. "Quite an interesting development." Beatrice nodded, her expression troubled. He was always asking about the Colonel's routines. The safe, it was all very secretive. The room seemed to contract around them, the shadows lengthening, the walls pressing closer. The manor was a stage, each line spoken another act in a play of deception, each player wearing a mask, carefully fitted to their role. Some were more convincing than others, and Eleanor was watching them all. Edward shifted under her gaze, the tension in his shoulders barely concealed. "If you'll excuse me," he muttered, already moving toward the door, "I have business to attend to." His departure left a silence in its wake, one that carried the weight of unspoken questions. Eleanor's hands stilled, her knitting needles pausing mid-stitch as her thoughts aligned. Greed, perhaps, a desperate man masking his fear with bravado, or was his unease something more? The smallest details, she knew, often unraveled the grandest of deceptions. She reached for the misplaced decanter, turning it slightly, the scent of its contents confirming what she already suspected. A fraction of a second later, the front door swung open once more, the crisp morning light barely creeping over the cobblestones outside, and then with the air of a man who expected the world to yield to his presence, Arthur Lennox stepped into Hawthorne Manor. The glint of his badge caught the dim light, flashing like a knife's edge. His arrival, Eleanor knew, was no coincidence, and if the game had not yet begun, it most certainly had now. The grand drawing room of Ravenshade Manor was steeped in an unsettling stillness, the heavy drapes swallowing what little daylight managed to seep through the high-arched windows. Inspector Graves, his uniform slightly rumpled from a sleepless night, stood at the center, his tired eyes betraying the weight of an investigation spiraling beyond control. "Harrow, thank God you're here," he exhaled, stepping aside almost too eagerly as the private investigator took his place. "This case, it's like sand slipping through my fingers." Damien Harrow, with his crisp attire and an air of effortless authority, merely nodded, his gaze sweeping the room like a hawk sizing up prey. "First we establish the timeline," he declared, his voice cool and methodical, "and then we speak to every last person who had dealings with the deceased." His eyes moved deliberately over each face, some defiant, some guarded, some too composed to be innocent. He began with Victor Langley, the late Lord Hawthorne's nephew, a man whose financial woes were the worst-kept secret in the county. "Mr. Langley, the late Lord's untimely demise puts you in a rather comfortable position, wouldn't you say?" Damien's words, though polite, carried the weight of a dagger slipping between ribs. Victor scoffed, but his fingers curled tight against the arm of the chair. "If you're suggesting I killed my own uncle over money, you're out of your mind. I was at the Black Hart Inn all evening. Ask the barkeep, ask anyone." Damien merely inclined his head, filing away the response as neither confirmation nor absolution. "We will. Every detail matters." His attention turned next to Eleanor Vale, the household's long-serving governess, her pallor ashen, her hands gripping a handkerchief, as if it were a lifeline. "Miss Vale, you were close to Lord Hawthorne. Any grievances between you?" Her eyes flitted toward the flickering candlelight, as though the truth lay hidden in the wavering shadows. I was upset with him, yes," she admitted, her voice quivering. "There were things we argued over, personal things, but I would never harm him." Damien watched her closely, noting the shallow breath, the restless fingers, the way her gaze flickered toward the fireplace, where embers barely clung to life. His questions were sharp, precise, prodding at the loose threads of their stories, seeking the place where the weave might unravel. But as he worked, a quiet observer sat in the farthest corner, needles clicking rhythmically against wool, her presence unassuming yet piercingly aware. Adeline Harrow, widow of Damien's late brother, continued knitting without pause, her keen eyes absorbing each inflection, each hesitation, each careful omission. She had lived in Ravenshade Manor long enough to know that the most damning confessions were never spoken aloud, but rather revealed in the moments people thought no one was watching. And it was Damien himself who intrigued her most. He wielded questions like a scalpel, slicing through alibis and hesitations, but there was something just a fraction too certain in his manner, a little too prepared, and when he mentioned Lord Hawthorne's private safe, its existence known only to the household, Adeline's hands stilled for just a moment. That information had never been made public. It had not even been mentioned in the official reports. How then did Damien Harrow know of it? She catalogued the detail, as she had catalogued the way his gaze lingered on the grand mahogany desk, the way his fingers brushed against a ledger with the lightest of touches, the way his interest in Lord Hawthorne's demise seemed personal. The manor itself was complicit in the tension, its grandeur now feeling oppressive, the intricate moldings and gilded mirrors reflecting nothing but unspoken secrets. Damien's questions, Adeline mused, were not those of a man trying to find the truth, but rather of someone ensuring the narrative unfolded precisely as he needed it to. As the questioning wrapped up, Damien outlined his next steps with an air of confidence that did not waver. A confidence that, to most might have seemed reassuring, but Adeline, her knitting needles resuming their quiet work, knew better. This was not a man searching for answers, this was a man who already knew them, and somewhere in the shadows of Ravenshade Manor, beneath the scent of old books, polished wood, and something far more dangerous, someone else was watching, waiting, knowing that the first misstep would cost more than just the truth. Ravenshade Manor stood as an unspoken guardian of its own secrets, its dark wood-paneled walls and dust-laden chandeliers whispering of intrigues long past and newly born. Damien Harrow, the renowned investigator whose reputation preceded him, leaned against the marble fireplace, his posture carefully composed, yet his fingers, those betrayers of the mind, tapped an unconscious rhythm against the cold stone. "Miss Harrow," he acknowledged as Adeline, her knitting needles clicking with the precision of a pendulum, offered him a nod that carried the weight of careful observation. "An unfortunate business, this case," he continued, his voice silk-laced steel, "but I assure you the truth will emerge." Adeline, her expression mild, allowed herself a moment's pause before responding. "Truth, Mr. Harrow, has a habit of resisting manipulation," she murmured, her eyes never leaving his jaw tightened, an imperceptible shift to most, but not to her. Before he could respond, Inspector Graves entered, his uniform bearing the crumpled testimony of sleepless nights. "Mr. Harrow, I assume you've gathered some insights," he said, weariness hanging on his words. "Indeed," Harrow replied smoothly, "but first the timeline must be cemented." His gaze swept the room, landing with equal weight on each present figure, Victor Langley, whose pockets were as empty as his alibi was full of holes; Eleanor Vale, whose tremulous hands betrayed a burden heavier than grief; and the ever-observant Adeline, whose quiet presence threatened to unspool whatever carefully woven narrative he had in mind. "Mr. Langley," Harrow began, his tone deceptively conversational, "you were in financial distress, were you not? One might say Lord Hawthorne's passing has been fortuitous." Victor scoffed, feigning offense, but his hands curled into fists against the polished armrest. "If you're implying I killed my uncle, you're mistaken. I was at the Black Hart Inn all evening. Ask anyone." "Oh, we will," Harrow assured him, his gaze already shifting. "And you, Miss Vale, you were among the last to see the late Lord alive. Was there any disagreement between you?" The governess, already pale, turned nearly translucent. "He had spoken to me about his will," she admitted hesitantly, "but I had no quarrel with him. If anything, I was concerned for his well-being, concerned enough to take matters into your own hands." Harrow pressed. A small gasp escaped her lips, but she shook her head vehemently. "No, I swear it." Harrow studied her a moment longer, then moved on, his questions slicing through alibis with calculated precision. Yet Adeline saw it, an almost imperceptible misstep. When Harrow mentioned Lord Hawthorne's private safe, her knitting paused for just a fraction of a second. That detail had not been made public. No reports mentioned it, no whispers carried it through the village. And yet, Harrow had spoken of it with the certainty of a man who had seen it with his own eyes. A misstep, small but damning. She catalogued it with the other inconsistencies, with the way his fingers hesitated over the papers on Lord Hawthorne's desk, the way he had known too quickly that the brandy decanter bore the faint imprint of gloved hands. Later, as the household retired to their respective quarters, Adeline took a deliberate detour, her steps measured as she slipped into the study where tragedy had struck. The room was a mausoleum of unanswered questions. The scent of cigars and aged brandy lingered, but beneath it, another fragrance, a cologne foreign to the late Lord's possessions. Her fingers ghosted over the decanter, noting the subtle smudge, and then to the mantel clock, its hands just slightly off, as though manipulated to obscure the true moment of death. And there, amidst the weighty tomes and ink-stained parchment, something even more telling, the indentation of where a small square object had once rested, now gone. The safe. She withdrew quietly, her mind knitting pieces together as deftly as her hands wove wool. The final thread fell into place at the village apothecary, where an eager young clerk, eager to gossip, revealed, "Oh, Miss Harrow, you'd never guess. Mr. Harrow was in here just the other day, purchasing a rather fine cologne. Quite an expensive one too." "Indeed," Adeline mused, her tone light, but her thoughts razor-sharp. Later, As she settled herself at the Ravenshade Inn, where conversations were as free-flowing as the ale, a hushed voice caught her ear. "Harrow knew about the safe before anyone else did. How's that for peculiar?" And peculiar it was. Her brother-in-law, the esteemed investigator, had known too much, too soon. The pieces of the mystery had once seemed scattered, but now they aligned with disturbing clarity. And in the shadows of Ravenshade Manor, where every glance carried weight and every silence spoke volumes, Adeline knew one thing for certain: Damien Harrow was not here merely to solve a crime. He was here to bury one. The village of Ashgrove, with its ivy-clad cottages and cobbled streets, basked under the golden hues of an autumn afternoon, but beneath the veneer of tranquility, a storm of secrets brewed. Eleanor Hayworth, a woman whose presence in town was as unassuming as the lacework she favored, sipped her tea with the grace of someone who knew far more than she let on. Across from her sat Mr. Lawrence Whittaker, the late Mr. Pembroke's solicitor, his polished demeanor intact, but his fingers twitching ever so slightly against the rim of his cup, a tell that did not escape Eleanor's watchful gaze. "It is a terrible business," he murmured, stirring sugar into his tea, though he never took it sweet. "Such a sudden passing." Eleanor inclined her head, her knitting needles moving in rhythmic precision, yet her mind turned over the details of the affair like pages in a well-worn novel. "Yes, tragic indeed," she mused, "especially when suddenness is not always so sudden." Lawrence's spoon clattered against the saucer, a misstep he quickly corrected, but Eleanor had seen it, just as she had noticed the missing letter opener from Pembroke's study, the faint indentation on the desk, where a heavy object had once rested, and the curious smudge on the brass handle of the study's French doors. "You were quite close to Mr. Pembroke, were you not?" she ventured, her voice warm but probing. "Naturally, as his legal advisor, then I suppose you knew about the codicil." A flicker of something unease calculation crossed Lawrence's face before he smoothed it away. "Codicil," he echoed, feigning innocence. "Yes, the one he mentioned to me not a week before his death. A last-minute amendment to his will, I believe." Eleanor's words were laced with the softness of idle chatter, yet they struck like a needle to flesh. Lawrence recovered swiftly, smiling in that polished way of his. "Ah, you must be mistaken, Miss Hayworth. No such document exists." "Oh, I see," she replied, taking a deliberate sip of her tea. "Then perhaps Mr. Pembroke only imagined he had made one." The silence that followed was more telling than any confession. Later that afternoon, Eleanor found herself drawn to Pembroke Manor, its grandeur shadowed by the weight of recent misfortune. The study bore the air of a place frozen in time, the scent of old paper and lingering pipe smoke clinging to the air. Her fingers traced the dust-free outline of a missing object, something removed in haste, its absence more conspicuous than its presence would have been. A faint scuff mark near the hearth caught her attention, as did the thin strand of silk snagged on the desk drawer, pale against the dark wood. Silk, from a gentleman's handkerchief perhaps, or from something more sinister. The pieces, scattered and seemingly disjointed, began knitting themselves together in her mind. At the village post office, where news traveled faster than the morning mail, a conversation confirmed her suspicions. "Strange, isn't it?" mused Mrs. Dobbins, the postmistress, leaning in conspiratorially. "Mr. Whittaker sent a rather urgent telegram the morning after Mr. Pembroke's death, to a London address no less. Quite the rush, wouldn't you say?" "Indeed," Eleanor murmured, her thoughts racing. By the time she took her evening stroll past the Black Swan Inn, where whispers and ale flowed in equal measure, the final stitch had fallen into place. "It was all too convenient," a voice muttered from the farthest table. "Pembroke was healthy as an ox, then suddenly gone, and now Whittaker's got his hands on that will. Mark my words, there's something off about it." Eleanor, blending effortlessly into the background, absorbed the words with quiet satisfaction. Yes, the pieces were all but aligned, and as the church bells tolled in the distance, their chimes weaving through the mist-laden village, she knew that the mystery, though expertly concealed, was but a thread's pull away from unraveling entirely. The village of Everwood lay shrouded in the amber glow of late afternoon, the winding lanes dappled with the soft flicker of gaslights, yet beneath its picturesque charm ran an undercurrent of unease that Eleanor Whitmore had long learned to detect. Seated in the well-worn armchair of her parlour, her hands moving in the measured rhythm of her embroidery, she listened as Mrs. Edith Redgrave, widow of the late Charles Redgrave, spoke in a voice weighed with years of unspoken grievances. "People say time heals," Edith murmured, eyes fixed on the rain-specked window, "but time only buries things until someone digs them up again." Eleanor's gaze drifted to the ornate frame upon the mantel, a photograph of a much younger Charles, his arm draped around another man whose features bore a striking resemblance to Edward Blackwood, the solicitor who had so recently inserted himself into village affairs. "And the gentleman beside him?" she inquired lightly. Edith's fingers tightened around her cup. "That's his cousin William. He vanished from Everwood after the scandal, before everything fell apart." Eleanor's needle stilled, her interest sharpening like a blade against a whetstone. "Scandal?" Edith hesitated, then exhaled a breath laced with something between regret and bitterness. "A betrayal of trust, Miss Whitmore. Charles discovered William had misappropriated funds from the family estate. It was hushed up, but the damage remained. William disappeared, and Charles was never the same." The fire crackled, the only sound in the hush that followed, as Eleanor traced the invisible threads that connected past misdeeds to the unease creeping through Everwood. "And Edward Blackwood, does he remind you of this William?" Edith's posture stiffened. "Now that you mention it, he does. There's something too knowing about him. Too familiar." A faint smile tugged at the corner of Eleanor's lips, though her mind was already racing ahead. "It's curious, isn't it, how the past has a way of resurfacing when one least expects it?" Edith said nothing, but in the flickering light, her expression was one of reluctant recognition. As Eleanor bid her farewell, the implications of their conversation wove themselves seamlessly into the fabric of her growing suspicions. The next morning, beneath the solemn chime of the church bells, she paid a visit to Reverend Henshaw, whose quiet vicarage stood like an island of calm amidst the turbulence of hidden truths. Over tea his voice, low and contemplative, carried a new revelation. "Charles came to me not long before he passed," the Reverend admitted, his fingers steepled in thought, "spoke of forgiveness. It was unlike him. He was never a man to seek absolution." Eleanor's brow lifted slightly. "And do you think he felt the weight of his past catching up with him?" Or perhaps, Henshaw mused, he sensed that his past was coming for him. The words settled heavily between them, the meaning unmistakable. Eleanor took a deliberate sip of tea, the puzzle rearranging itself in her mind. Outside, the village of Everwood hummed with the quiet murmurs of its people, the cobblestone paths lined with secrets waiting to be unearthed. That evening, at the dimly lit Fox and Hound Inn, where ale flowed as freely as gossip, Eleanor settled into the corner booth, listening as Mr. Ambrose, the innkeeper, leaned in with the air of a man holding a tantalizing secret. "Strange thing, Miss Whitmore," he murmured. "That solicitor Blackwood, he was here under another name weeks before Mr. Redgrave's passing, called himself Edward Hartley." Eleanor's fork paused mid-air, a single name altering the shape of everything she had begun to suspect. "Hartley, you say, and when exactly was this?" "Right around the time Charles started receiving those anonymous letters." A measured silence followed, broken only by the distant chime of the clock tower, marking time as the past and present tangled themselves into a mystery, now too intricate to ignore. Eleanor's lips curved into a knowing smile, her mind already pulling at the thread that would unravel it all. The village of Ashford lay beneath a thick veil of mist, the cobblestone streets slick with the remnants of an autumn drizzle, lanterns casting a flickering golden hue upon the damp stones. Eleanor Blackwood, known to most as an unassuming woman of quiet observation, stood at the edge of the village square, her sharp gaze tracking the figures that moved about their evening errands. She had long since learned that it was in these mundane moments that the truth often whispered the loudest. Across from her, nestled between the bakery and the apothecary, sat the King's Folly, a tavern whose low beams and smoke-stained walls had borne witness to more secrets than the church confessional. It was here that she had followed Henry Castor, a man whose arrival in Ashford had coincided too conveniently with the troubles surrounding the late Mr. Alistair Moore. She stepped inside, the scent of ale and damp wool thick in the air, and took a quiet corner, her hands lightly resting around a cup of tea she had no intention of drinking. She listened, allowing the ebb and flow of conversation to drift towards her until a familiar voice punctuated the haze of chatter. "I tell you it wasn't chance. A man like that doesn't simply appear out of nowhere." Thomas Harrow, the innkeeper, to a companion whose face remained obscured by the low light. "Castor's been asking too many questions, and not the sort a grieving associate would ask. He's looking for something Moore had." Eleanor's pulse quickened, but her expression remained composed, her eyes flickering only briefly toward the pair before returning to the rhythmic motions of the tavern. A name change, an arrival just before Moore's sudden passing, whispers of hidden motives. It was all too neatly arranged, more a careful orchestration than a happenstance visit. Her mind threaded through the pieces, the pattern emerging like a tapestry woven from shadows and half-truths. With a final glance at Castor, who sat nursing a drink with a calculated nonchalance, she slipped out into the night, the village's breath cold against her skin. The road to Moore Manor wound through towering oaks, their skeletal branches clawing at the star-dusted sky, and as she approached, the vast silhouette of the house loomed before her, like an unspoken warning. Lights burned in the study, a curious thing given the estate had been left in disarray since Moore's death. Eleanor's steps were careful as she made her way around the back, her excuse prepared should she be discovered. A borrowed book, forgotten in the late man's library, a small enough deception to pass unquestioned. The latch on the side door gave way easily, and the scent of dust and aged wood filled her lungs as she stepped into the grand but hollowed-out halls of the manor. The silence pressed against her ears, but a distant sound, the faintest creak of floorboards, told her she was not alone. Moving with practiced ease, she navigated toward the study, where shadows flickered against the crack beneath the door. A man stood within, his back to her, rifling through Moore's desk with the urgency of one searching for something long buried. The papers rustled, drawers slid open, and then in the dim light, the man turned. Castor. His face sharp with determination, hardened when his eyes locked into Eleanor's. "Miss Blackwood," he greeted, his voice cool but edged with something darker. "I must admit I wasn't expecting company." Eleanor took a slow step forward, her hands clasped before her, as though she were nothing more than an idle guest. "Nor was I expecting to find you here, Mr. Castor. Such late hours for a man merely settling an estate." His jaw tightened, but his smirk remained. "Curiosity can be dangerous, Miss Blackwood, as can secrets," she countered, her gaze unwavering. "Tell me, what is it you're so desperate to find?" A silence stretched between them, taut as a pulled thread, and in that moment Eleanor knew he had come looking for something worth killing for. The village, its charming facades and winding lanes, had always been a keeper of secrets, but some secrets had claws, and in Ashford, the past was never truly buried. She had nudged the truth, and now it was only a matter of time before the facade of innocence cracked, revealing the darkness that lay beneath. The wind carried a ghostly whisper through the skeletal trees that lined the road to Blackwood Manor, their branches clawing at the sky like accusing fingers. Eleanor Ashcroft moved through the swirling mist with the quiet confidence of a woman accustomed to navigating the shadows of deception. The manor, once a proud structure of wealth and influence, now stood as a relic of secrets buried beneath years of dust and neglect. As she reached the heavy oak doors, they groaned under the weight of time and resistance, yielding just enough to allow her entry. Inside, the grand hall stretched before her, its vast emptiness amplifying the rhythmic tick of an unseen clock, each second a heartbeat in the silence. She had come under the pretense of retrieving a book she had lent to the late Victor Blackwood, but her true purpose lay beyond mere literature. She moved with deliberate ease, her keen eyes tracing the contours of the dimly lit corridor as she approached the library. The scent of aged parchment and extinguished candles filled the air, mingling with the cold bite of forgotten memories. But she was not alone. A figure loomed in the doorway, his presence unexpected yet anticipated. "Miss Ashcroft," murmured William Mercer, his voice laced with the practiced civility of a man accustomed to masking unease. A late visit for something as trivial as a book. His silhouette, outlined against the faint glow of the dying embers in the fireplace, betrayed a weariness, or was it something deeper? "Books have a way of holding answers," she replied smoothly, stepping forward with measured grace. "Much like the walls of this house, if one knows where to look." Mercer exhaled slowly, his posture shifting, the weight of unseen burdens pressing against his frame. "If you're here for answers, Miss Ashcroft, you may be disappointed. Victor was a complicated man, but murder, that is a word too heavy for the Blackwood name." She studied him, noting the tension in his jaw, the flicker of something akin to regret in his eyes. "Hatred and murder are often separated by the thinnest of veils, Mr. Mercer. And the louder one protests, the more one wonders what truly lies beneath." A silence settled between them, thick with the unspoken. Then, as if compelled by some unseen force, Mercer sighed, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I wanted his fortune, yes, but not at the cost of his life." Eleanor watched him, her mind cataloguing the revelation not as truth, but as a thread in the ever-expanding tapestry of deception. Excusing herself, she slipped past him into the study, where Victor Blackwood had drawn his last breath. The air remained heavy with a presence long since extinguished, and her eyes roamed the room, seeking the inconsistencies that often betrayed the carefully curated scenes of crime. Dust lay undisturbed across the desk, the brandy untouched, a stark contrast to the desperate struggle the coroner's report had detailed. But it was the ornate painting above the fireplace that drew her attention, its frame bearing the faintest trace of disruption. With delicate precision, she shifted it aside, revealing what she had suspected, a safe, its combination untouched, its secrets undisturbed. The realization sent a thrill of clarity through her veins. Whoever had taken Blackwood's life had not done so for greed alone. This was no ordinary crime, this was personal. As she carefully replaced the painting, the echo of distant footsteps snapped her from her thoughts. The house, with all its grandeur, suddenly felt smaller, its shadows more oppressive. The killer had sought to bury something here, something more valuable than mere wealth. And in a village where gossip wove tighter than the fabric of society itself, it was always the most dangerous truths that remained locked behind iron doors. With the dawn casting long fingers of light across the village, Eleanor made her way to the modest confines of the local constabulary, where Inspector Graham awaited, his face creased with skepticism and reluctant admiration. "Miss Ashcroft," he greeted, his tone betraying the inevitable exasperation of a man too often outpaced by an amateur sleuth. "I assume this is not a social visit." She met his gaze with the quiet assurance of someone who held more answers than questions. "It's about William Mercer," she began, her voice carrying the weight of revelation, or rather about what he knows but refuses to say. Graham's brow furrowed, his hand resting atop a stack of case files that now seemed woefully inadequate. "You suspect him?" "I suspect everyone, Inspector," she replied smoothly. "But Mercer's motives, however compelling, do not align with the truth. The safe in Blackwood Manor remains locked. Whatever Victor died for, it was not mere fortune. And there's another player in this game, someone whose presence is far more dangerous." A shadow of realization crossed Graham's features. Then we must confront him. Their journey back to the manor was marked by silence, the weight of their shared purpose thick in the cool morning air. As they approached, a familiar figure stood waiting. Mercer, his usual confidence fractured by the sight of the inspector at Eleanor's side. "Mr. Mercer," Graham called out, his voice firm, his stride unyielding. or should I say, Mr. Carlyle, your name, much like your alibi, appears to be forged." Mercer's smirk flickered, the carefully maintained mask slipping as Eleanor stepped forward, her voice soft but unwavering. "The past has a way of catching up, Mr. Mercer, and in Blackwood Manor, the past is never truly buried. The house, once a sanctuary of wealth and status, now stood as a monument to a single inescapable truth: secrets, no matter how well concealed, always find their way to the surface." The flickering glow of the candle cast long restless shadows across the mahogany walls of Ashford Manor, their movements mirroring the tension thick in the air as Evelyn Harcourt fixed her gaze on the man before her. Jonathan Graves, the enigmatic outsider, whose arrival had stirred unease in the quiet village of Black Hollow, stood with his back to the grand study's towering bookcases, his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack under the weight of revelation. "You think you understand," his voice, once smooth as silk, now carried the tremor of a man exposed, "but you don't know the depths of it." Evelyn tilted her head, her calm demeanor sharpened by the relentless precision of her deductions. "Don't I?" she mused, holding up the tattered letter she had retrieved from the late Lord Ashford's desk. The ink had faded with time, but the name scrawled at the bottom, Theodore Lorne, was clear enough to set everything into motion. Jonathan's jaw tightened, his fingers twitching at his sides, and for the first time since their game of deception had begun, Evelyn saw something dangerously close to desperation. "You came here under false pretenses, Mr. Graves. A private investigator? No, you are something else entirely. Theodore Lorne was your father, wasn't he? The very man Lord Ashford accused of theft, and sent to ruin 20 years ago." The room itself seemed to constrict, the heavy drapes absorbing the breathless silence between them, the ticking of the study's ornate clock, a cruel reminder that time was running out. Jonathan exhaled, a sound caught between anger and exhaustion. He lost everything, his name, his livelihood, and when he tried to reclaim his honor, Ashford ensured he never would. His voice darkened. "He died with nothing, Miss Harcourt. While Ashford sat here, in this house built on the misfortune of others, reveling in the destruction he had caused." Evelyn studied him, her mind already arranging the final pieces of the puzzle. "So you came back, not as a victim but as an architect of justice." A bitter chuckle escaped Jonathan's lips. "Justice? No, Miss Harcourt. There is no justice for men like Ashford, only retribution." The truth, now stripped of its layers, lay bare between them like an open wound, and yet Evelyn continued, stepping closer. The night of his death, the safe in his study remained untouched. "If revenge was your aim, why not take the fortune he stole from your father?" Jonathan's expression darkened, the flicker of control returning to his gaze. "Because money was never the debt that needed to be settled." The words hung between them, heavy with finality. From the corner of the room, Inspector Alden, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. "So you admit to it?" Jonathan turned, his lips pressing into a tight line. "I admit nothing, Inspector. I merely suggest that some crimes are not committed in darkness, but in broad daylight, under the guise of respectability." But Evelyn knew better, knew that Jonathan Graves, or rather Theodore Lorne's son, had woven himself into the fabric of Black Hollow, not simply to uncover the past, but to rewrite its ending. And now, standing in the same study where Lord Ashford had drawn his final breath, he was caught between the ghost of his father and the truth that could no longer be buried. The house, once a monument to power, had become the stage for a reckoning long overdue, and in Black Hollow, where whispers traveled faster than the wind, the past had finally returned to claim its due. The chilling wind howled through the towering spires of Ravenscroft Manor as the grand hall stood shrouded in an uneasy silence, its crystal chandeliers casting fractured reflections across the polished marble floor. Evelyn Harcourt, with her poised demeanor and calculating gaze, surveyed the gathered assembly, the accused, the complicit, and the unsuspecting, each one ensnared in a web of deception more intricate than they had imagined. At the heart of the storm stood Victor Alden, his hands bound, his face pale beneath the flickering candlelight, stripped of the aristocratic confidence that once cloaked his every movement. "So this is how it ends," he murmured, his voice tinged with something between resignation and defiance. Inspector Langford, his uniform crisp but his patience worn, stepped forward. "Victor Alden, you are under arrest for the murder of Lord Barrington," he announced, the weight of justice pressing heavy upon the grand chamber. But Evelyn raised a gloved hand, halting the inspector in his path. "Not yet, Inspector. The final piece of the puzzle remains unspoken." A murmur rippled through the room, eyes darting toward the lady detective whose unerring mind had dismantled their carefully constructed facades. "You all assume this is a simple tale of revenge, of debts left unpaid, and honor sought through blood," she continued, her tone unyielding. "But murder, true murder, is never that simple. It is born from fear, from desperation, from secrets buried too deep to remain hidden." She turned her gaze to Eleanor Barrington, the widow draped in black, her trembling fingers clutching at her pearls. "You knew, didn't you, Lady Barrington?" The widow stiffened, her breath hitching. "Knew what?" she whispered, though the answer already lay heavy upon her conscience. Evelyn stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the marble, her voice a scalpel cutting through pretense. "That your husband's death was not simply a matter of revenge, but of necessity, because Lord Barrington had uncovered a truth too dangerous to be spoken aloud, a truth that would have unraveled everything." The room bristled with tension as Evelyn pulled a faded envelope from the folds of her coat, the wax seal cracked, the parchment within bearing the unmistakable scrawl of the deceased nobleman. "Lord Barrington was no saint," she declared. "His hands were stained long before he met his untimely end. But someone in this very room was desperate enough to ensure his silence before the truth could be revealed." Victor Alden, bound yet unbroken, let out a slow breath, a bitter smile playing at his lips. "And what truth might that be, Miss Harcourt?" he challenged. Evelyn met his gaze, unflinching. "That you, Mr. Alden, are not the true heir of Ravenscroft Manor." A gasp echoed through the chamber, the weight of her revelation like a thunderclap in the storm. The real heir was cast aside long ago, hidden away under another name, his existence buried beneath layers of deception. Her eyes flicked toward the unsuspecting figure of Henry Whitmore, the quiet solicitor who had lingered at the edges of the gathering, his brow furrowed in confusion. "And you, Mr. Whitmore, were the key to it all." Henry staggered back, his eyes wide with dawning horror. That's impossible," he stammered. "I've lived my entire life as nothing more than a man of the law." But Evelyn's gaze did not waver. "And yet, it is the law itself that dictated your fate," she countered. "Your birthright was stolen, your lineage erased, and when Lord Barrington discovered the truth, someone ensured he would never reveal it." Silence engulfed the room, the air thick with unspoken confessions. Inspector Langford straightened, his eyes flicking between the faces before him. "Then the question remains," he said gravely. "Who committed the murder?" A slow, deliberate clap broke the silence, drawing all eyes to the corner of the room where Desmond Hawthorne, the ever-smirking confidant of the late Lord Barrington, leaned against the grand fireplace. "Bravo, Miss Harcourt," he drawled, amusement dancing in his dark eyes. "I must commend your ingenuity." He stepped forward, the smirk never wavering, even as the room seemed to shrink around him. "But I'm afraid you've overlooked one minor detail." Evelyn raised a brow, unperturbed. "And what might that be, Mr. Hawthorne?" His smile widened, but his eyes remained cold. "That sometimes the best laid plans require more than one architect." The air in the room grew heavy, the realization sinking in. This was not the work of a single hand, but a carefully orchestrated symphony of betrayal. Evelyn exhaled, her mind already racing ahead, pulling the remaining threads together. "Then let us see how deep this conspiracy runs, shall we?" she murmured, stepping forward as the walls of Ravenscroft Manor seemed to close in, not just on the guilty, but on the very fabric of the past itself. The heavy silence of Blackthorn Manor was fractured only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock, each measured chime marking the slow unraveling of deception that had for too long been disguised as truth. Miss Eleanor Graves, her posture unshaken, her knitting needles now idle in her lap, let her sharp gaze sweep across the assembled faces, each shadowed by the weight of their secrets. "Let us begin with the past," she said, her voice calm yet heavy with unspoken revelations. Everett Stokes was no stranger to hidden sins, a man revered for his medical brilliance, yet beneath his practiced smile lay a history of whispered scandals, of patients who vanished, of fortunes mysteriously shifted. But one act sealed his fate, the theft of the Langford inheritance, an act that destroyed one family and planted the seed of vengeance in another. Her eyes flicked toward Nathaniel Langford, his fists clenched at his sides, his face unreadable but his pulse betraying the storm within. Mr. Langford returned not as himself, but under the guise of Theodore Wells, a manservant, an observer, a patient weaver of fate, a man who found his way into the doctor's trust, waiting for the moment when justice, long denied, could finally be delivered. A ripple of unease spread through the room as the true depth of the deception became apparent. The brandy, poured with the same habitual grace that defined the doctor's every evening ritual, had been laced with a toxin as insidious as the sins he had committed. It was done with precision, Eleanor continued, her voice unwavering, a slow-acting agent, one that ensured the doctor would retire to his study before the poison took hold, making his collapse appear as natural as time claiming its due. A strangled gasp escaped Margaret Stokes, the widow's hands trembling as the reality of her husband's fate solidified. "But the locked door," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "How could simple," Miss Graves interjected, her eyes now resting on Helen Cartwright, the ever-dutiful housekeeper whose loyalty had been taken for granted. "The borrowed key, Miss Cartwright, taken from the ring you carry each night, used to create the illusion of an impossible crime." Helen's face drained of color, her breath coming in shallow gulps. I didn't know," she stammered. "I only lent it for a moment, I never thought." And yet Eleanor pressed, it was enough. The room, grand yet suffocating, seemed to tighten around its occupants as the puzzle took its final shape. The study's clock, ever the silent witness, had been tampered with, a desperate attempt to distort the timeline, but an attempt undone by a single, telling flaw. The hands, though moved, had not been perfectly realigned, betraying the deception. Nathaniel Langford, stripped now of his assumed identity, exhaled slowly, the weight of his carefully constructed plan crumbling before him. "You speak of justice," he said, his voice raw, "but what of the justice my family never received? The lives destroyed by his greed?" Miss Graves met his gaze, neither condemning nor absolving. "Revenge may mimic justice, Mr. Langford," she said softly, "but in the end it consumes only the one who seeks it." He looked away, his defiance hollow, the fight drained from his frame. The tension in the room shifted, the faces of those present reflecting the quiet reckoning that had settled over Blackthorn Manor. Inspector Hale, whose authority had momentarily been overshadowed by the unassuming woman before him, stepped forward. "Nathaniel Langford, you are under arrest for the murder of Dr. Everett Stokes." The words were final, irrevocable. As the inspector's men moved in, the grand doors of the salon opened, the chill of the encroaching evening air whispering through the heavy drapes. Outside, the village stood in a hush, its streets watching as justice, or something akin to it, was carried away in iron shackles. In the days that followed, the shadow that had loomed over Blackthorn Manor began to dissipate, though the echoes of the past would never fade completely. Whispers of betrayal, of greed and retribution, wove themselves into the fabric of the town's history, another story to be exchanged in hushed tones over flickering candlelight. And as for Miss Graves, she resumed her quiet knitting, her hands steady, her mind ever watchful, for in a world riddled with deception, the sharpest weapon was not force nor fury, but the simple, unrelenting gaze of one who truly sees. As the twilight deepened over Ravenshade Hollow, a village where whispers carried farther than the wind, Eleanor Finch stepped out of the grand iron gates of Ashworth Manor, leaving behind its towering walls and the ghosts that still lingered within. The past week had unveiled the rot beneath its opulent exterior, a tale of betrayal, greed, and a carefully orchestrated murder, all unraveled by the keen mind of Miss Finch, whose unassuming presence hid a brilliance sharper than any blade. She had seen what envy could do, how it corroded hearts and turned love into loathing. Now, with the case resolved, the village exhaled, yet the scars of deception would not fade so easily. In the quiet refuge of her cottage, Miss Finch sat by the fireplace, her knitting needles clicking methodically, as she let her thoughts drift over the tangled web she had so recently unspooled. Across town, at the bustling Rosewood Inn, the air buzzed with speculation. "Did you hear how she found out?" whispered Margaret Holloway, her fingers tightening around her teacup. The poison hidden in the candied plums, who would have thought? The tale was already taking on a life of its own, morphing with each telling, details shifting like smoke. But Miss Finch cared little for the gossip. To her the satisfaction lay in the puzzle itself, in the delicate interplay of truth and illusion, in the way the guilty always betrayed themselves in the end. The case had hinged on the most minute of details, a single misaligned drawer in the victim's study, a sign that someone had rifled through his papers before the murder, searching for something of value. That single clue had set her on a path that exposed an inheritance scheme, a false identity, and ultimately, a betrayal so bitter that murder had seemed its only resolution. Now, with the truth laid bare, Ravenshade Hollow returned to its routines, its cobbled streets washed clean by an evening rain, but the undercurrents remained. Secrets, like roots, ran deep here, and though one had been severed, many more lay entwined beneath the surface. The hollow was never truly silent. Miss Finch knew that well. Darkness had a way of creeping back in, slipping through the cracks like a draft in an old house. And when it did, she would be there, watching, waiting, her mind ever sharp, her needles ever clicking, ready to tug at the next loose thread in the fabric of deception.